All right, because I think we have an hour and a lot to speak about. I think I will get started. So I'm Tyrus Miller. I'm Dean of the School of Humanities, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you here today to hear a presentation of From Foundations to Frontiers, a landmark study of the enduring contribution of Chinese Americans to American society from the 1800s to today. We'll be hearing a presentation of some highlights of this report, 2 responses, and then we'll have some time for some questions from our audience for the presenters. Please use the question and answer function to enter your questions. You can enter them at any time during the presentations or after. I'll be moderating and posing the questions to the presenters. So I'll start by saying a word about the Committee of 100, which is a nonpartisan leadership organization of prominent Chinese Americans in business, government, academia, and the arts. It has a dual mission, that is promoting the full participation of all Chinese Americans in American society and acting as a public policy resource for the Chinese American community. And second, advancing the constructive dialogue and relationships between the peoples and leaders of the United States and Greater China. I'll welcome our distinguished guest from the Committee of 100, Lloyd Fang, who is a program associate of the Committee of 100, where he's been for the past year and a half. As part of his day-to-day responsibilities, he serves as the overall lead for the Foundations to Frontiers project, which is a research initiative, as I've said, looking at 175 years of Chinese American contributions to the United States. He's a graduate of Princeton University, majoring in art and archaeology with a minor in East Asian studies. While at Princeton, Lloyd helped successfully advocate for Princeton's program in Asian American Studies, which began issuing diplomas in 2018. I'll also greet our panelists who will be responding to the presentation. Professor Judy Su-Chun Wu, Professor of Asian American Studies and the Director of the UCI Humanities Center, which is the Humanities Hub, Research Hub, and Programming Hub for the School of Humanities at UCI. And Jennifer Wang, Chief Operating Officer of Asian American Senior Citizens Service Center. So welcome both of you, and we look forward to hearing your response and discussion of the report. And now I'd like to welcome Douglas Haynes, UCI Vice Chancellor for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and Professor of History, who will make some opening remarks about the significance of this event and the topics we'll be discussing today. Vice Chancellor Haynes.
Thank you so much, Dean Miller. Good afternoon on this Southern California day. Wherever you are, I hope the sun is shining. On behalf of our Chancellor, Howard Gilman, I want to welcome you to this important webinar entitled From Foundations to Frontiers. I am so delighted that the Office of Inclusive Excellence serves as a campus sponsor. This event matters to the University of California, Irvine, and let me tell you why. As you are aware, this month is Asian American Pacific Island Heritage Month. It serves as an opportunity and platform to celebrate the rich diversity of UC Irvine, the state of California, and the United States. UCI is unique, particularly among the public and private research universities in the United States, insofar that we have secured federal designation as an Asian American, Native American, and Pacific Islander serving institution. We proudly serve the residents of Orange County and the state of California while reaching across the country and world. UCI has been, remains, and will continue to be a destination for Chinese Americans to participate in our compelling mission as students and scholars. They include our distinguished faculty, our accomplished graduate students, our talented undergraduates, and our truly dedicated career staff employees. This presentation is important not only to remind ourselves to celebrate API communities, as well as to recognize UCI's connections to the Asian American communities throughout the state and the country, but it's also an opportunity to highlight the many contributions Chinese Americans have made to the fabric of the United States for well over 150 years. And in saying that, I also want to provide another reason why this is an important event. It's an important event because together we are standing in solidarity against Asian American discrimination, which, as many of you know, has been on an uptick throughout the United States. So again, I want to thank you and welcome you for joining us for this important webinar, From Foundations to Frontiers. So thank you again. And now I'd like to hand it back to Dean Miller.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor Haynes. I'll say a little bit about the report by way of introduction. It highlights the diversity of Chinese American communities and their increasingly prominent and constructive roles in the economic, social, cultural, and institutional life of the United States. It is a very timely report as we witness a rising tide of prejudice and violence against Chinese Americans and other Asian Americans during the pandemic. It's important to remember the contributions of Chinese Americans and the historical roots of anti-Asian racism in various forms. We know there have been many incidents. On March 16th, 2021, 6 Asian women were killed in a series of mass shootings, and this is by no means an isolated incident. The Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at Cal State San Bernardino examined police data from 16 jurisdictions across the country, finding a 164% increase in reports of anti-Asian hate crimes in the first quarter of 2021 compared with the same period last year. From mid-March 2020 to the end of March 2021, there were 6,603 reported hate incidents against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, as reported to Stop AAPI Hate, a California-based reporting center for such crimes and its partner advocacy groups. Now, we also know that these incidents didn't come out of the immediate present, but have long and unfortunately deep historical roots in American history. Examples of violence, such as the 1871 massacre of Chinese in Los Angeles, in which an angry mob brutally murdered 18 Chinese men, marking the beginning of large-scale violence against the Chinese in the West. In the Rocky Springs massacre of 1885, one of the bloodiest and racially motivated mass violence against Chinese in America, at least 28 Chinese people were killed and 15 wounded. There was a slew of anti-Chinese legislation institutionalizing anti-Chinese racism and making the Chinese politically and legally vulnerable and defenseless. And as has been stressed, in this pandemic period, there were historic corollaries in earlier times with scapegoating and blaming of the Chinese community for the spread of disease in epidemic situations. We can point to the very consequential 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned Chinese labor immigration for 10 years, was extended later and became permanent in 1904, denying Chinese immigrants the right to become naturalized citizens, and thus reaffirming the principle established by the 1790 Naturalization Act that only free white persons could be naturalized as US citizens. So a very strong entwinement of anti-Asian racism with the history of white supremacy and of racism in the United States. Chinese Americans also have a long, distinguished history of fighting for their rights, and in doing so, safeguarding fundamental civil and constitutional rights for all Americans, such as the landmark Supreme Court case, United States versus Wong Kim Ark of 1898, which upheld the fundamental constitutional principle that citizenship is a birthplace right, which was established by the 14th Amendment. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. Today, Chinese Americans continue to fight against anti-Asian prejudice and racism, and the Committee of 100 is one of the most vocal voices in that struggle. Many individuals and organizations across the nation have joined Chinese Americans in denouncing anti-Asian violence, and we are together in the struggle against racism. On behalf of the School of Humanities and the UCI community, I'm pleased and honored that the Committee of 100 present its report to us today and allow us the opportunity to discuss it. So Lloyd, I'll ask you now to begin your presentation, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Dean Miller, for those kind remarks. I feel like at this point I really need to give a presentation because it was so thorough. But really, on behalf of C100, thank you, Chancellor Haynes, Dean Miller, of course, Professor Wu, and Professor Young Chen of the History Department for really being the connective tissue that brought this event together, and of course, Ms. Wang of the AASCSC for hosting our presentation today. And then thank you to the audience members for taking the time to listen to our presentation of From Foundations to Frontiers. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to give my colleague Grace a shout out. She's managing the slides today. Next slide, please. So our presentation will cover what motivated C100 to commission this study, some important data and narratives that may not be as apparent in the general understanding of Chinese Americans, key takeaways, and a call to action / ways we can all come together to make a difference for the Chinese American community and for Asian Americans overall. Next slide, please. Apologies for the background noise. Based out in New York, a lot of things going on here. So before we begin, I also wanted to remind everybody of our microsite that houses the white paper and 7 pillar reports covering industries like arts and culture, civil rights, public service and politics, entrepreneurship and business leadership, infrastructure, military and national security, public health, and science and technology. Feel free to access it via the link on the slide, which I'll also drop in the chat later on. Next slide, please. So C100 commissioned the Economist Intelligence Unit, the research and consulting arm of the Economist publication, to conduct the said research on Chinese Americans. Why did we commission this research on Chinese Americans in the first place? Well, as audience members probably know, the US has always benefited greatly from being a multi-pluralistic, diverse, and inclusive society by taking in new ideas, values, and mindsets from around the world. If we think of all the innovation from immigrants, cultural offerings, and cuisines that have enriched American life and society, immigration and diversity are clear no-brainers. After all, race is still a huge central issue in the US, accelerating the need for our community and the overall American community to really know its own history and its past and current role in race relations. However, in the past few years, and especially in 2020, and now this year, we've witnessed a skyrocketing in anti-Chinese sentiment that quickly expanded to overall anti-Asian sentiment, and that will most likely not disappear anytime soon. And as Dean Miller laid out so clearly, anti-Asian hate has made national headlines and finally has the attention of our lawmakers, with anti-hate bills now on President Biden's desk for signing tomorrow. As such, we saw and still see a real need for Americans to hear a more truthful, more positive narrative of Chinese Americans grounded in facts and data that acknowledge the real history of contributions and continued struggle in this country. This is, of course, our first edition of our project From Foundations to Frontiers, one that we hope is a long-term one aimed at including more voices, experiences, and data, filling some of the gaps that you'll probably discover when you explore the microsite and some of the research itself. We understand that, female voices, LGBT voices, as well as topics like multiracial coalition building and some tensions and some of the tougher parts of our history aren't as acknowledged, and we hope to do that with your help going forward. We also see in this piece of literature not only being a helpful centerpiece in educating Chinese Americans and Chinese America, but also as a really useful piece to aid the American public's understanding of Chinese Americans as fundamentally American. We also hope that the media, policymakers at all levels of government, think tanks, and business leaders can draw on our study to use in their discussions about US-China, as well as topics related to Chinese in America, as well as Chinese Americans. Next slide, please. So what does our community look like? We are 5.3 million strong, composed of 3.9 million US citizens and 1.3 million non-citizens, encompassing permanent residents and visa holders. This is a group nowhere close to being monolithic, but filled with incredible diversity. Although our community is more highly educated on average than the national average, with 58% of Chinese Americans holding a bachelor's degree or higher, 20% of Chinese Americans do not speak proficient English. And although Chinese Americans overall have an income level above the national average, 1 in 10 households still earns less than $15,000 each year, and 35% have incomes below the national median of $68,000. Next slide, please. Chinese Americans are also diverse in our ethnic backgrounds and origins. About 80% of Chinese Americans identify as solely Chinese, with the remaining 20% representing multi-ethnic or multiracial backgrounds. Members of our community not only hail from the regions of mainland China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, but also Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines, and Latin America, representing some of the different waves of immigration and routes Chinese immigrants took in coming to America. Chinese Americans are also spread throughout the US. New York, SF, LA, Hawaii, and the DC area, of course, represent some of the largest hubs of Chinese Americans. But as evidenced by the chart here, we are a growing presence in some places that may at first seem unexpected, including Texas, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Washington State, and Florida. Next slide, please. No presentation on Chinese American history or of Chinese American contributions would be complete without a discussion of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, a particularly dark moment in American history whose impact is still felt today. From the 1850s through the late 1870s, Chinese immigrants came to the West Coast seeking better economic opportunities than they had in Qing Dynasty China, and as a means of earning income to send back to their relatives. Due to their lack of legal protection and pressure to earn that income, Chinese laborers often took low-wage work below the wages that were paid to white laborers, which ended up creating more competition for jobs. This led to deep resentment from white laborers now displaced from work or just facing more competition for work in general. Domestic resentment from these white labor interests led to legislative action at the state level, specifically restricting the rights of Chinese in America, as well as immigration pathways to the US. At the same time, extrajudicial acts of violence were often committed against Chinese here, just like Dean Miller mentioned, without strong mechanisms of enforcement to deter such crime and the lack of political will to prosecute such crime. Driven by anti-Chinese sentiment and opportunistic politicians, the US Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which stayed in effect for 6 decades until 1943. The act then barred the entry of Chinese workers and prohibited Chinese people from becoming citizens through naturalization. As a result, Chinese Americans were restricted to the margins of society, facing limited employment opportunities and possessing no real political power. This piece of legislation strongly contributed to the reversal of the trend of increasing Chinese immigration, apparent on the chart here. Next slide, please. Zooming back out to look at the overall history of Chinese ethnic immigration to the US, we see a tapestry of difficult periods and challenges to Chinese Americans in fully establishing ourselves as American. In addition to the Chinese Exclusion Act, there were other restrictive policies that targeted Chinese Americans. It certainly was not the last. One example is the California Alien Land Law of 1913 that prevented ownership or long-term leasing of land. Of course, this is also against the backdrop of several other racist policies targeting Black Americans, like Jim Crow laws and Plessy v. Ferguson, laws targeting Jewish Americans, Irish Americans, Italian Americans, Eastern Europeans in America, and so on. I also wanted to highlight the Page Act of 1875, which specifically barred not only Chinese women, but also other Asian women in America, casting Asian women as prostitutes and morally bankrupt. The hypersexualization of Asian women, something made abundantly bare to the American public amid the Atlanta killings in March of this year, has a direct root in this historical moment and piece of legislation. This law aimed to prevent Chinese and Asians from reproducing here and forming families on American soil. In 1943, the US Congress repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act, but still kept restrictions against Chinese here in place for the most part. It wasn't until the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 that these restrictions were truly lifted and Chinese immigrants could come to the US and stay on more equal footing with other immigrant groups. Next slide, please. So now that we have an overview of Chinese immigration to the U.S., this is just a brief overview of the rest of the presentation. Given our stable of wonderful speakers today, our presentation will be a little short here. So I'll only go through some of these categories that you can see on the screen here. Next slide, please. So Chinese Americans today are present in a wide variety of industries and occupations. We're making contributions as chefs, taxi drivers, bankers, lawyers, scientists, teachers, accountants, among other occupations. In the US workforce, there are 2.3 million Chinese Americans. Chinese Americans also contribute over just about $304 billion in consumer spending, supporting 3 million jobs in this country, many of which in turn support non-Chinese Americans. Entrepreneurship has also been one of the key avenues by which Chinese Americans have not only carved out livelihoods for themselves, but also made a remarkable impact on their overall community. Chinese restaurants are one prime example of just this. 1 in 10 businesses that provide food and accommodation services is Chinese American owned. Another amazing data point we discovered is that there are 45,000 Chinese restaurants, far eclipsing the number of McDonald's, Pizza Huts, Taco Bells, and Wendy's combined. In the corporate world and white collar industries, however, despite Chinese Americans' overrepresentation in the entry level and mid-level ranks, Chinese Americans are still vastly underrepresented in senior level executive positions. Chinese Americans face a bamboo ceiling where white professionals are 3 times as likely to reach executive ranks. Next slide, please. Likewise, Chinese Americans have made significant contributions in infrastructure. In the late 1800s, Chinese workers made up 90% of the labor force that built the western half of the Central Pacific Railroad and worked on other rail projects that linked the US. The completion of the railroads connected the country, enabling even greater economic growth and connectivity. Within 10 years of completion, the Transcontinental Railroad transported $1.3 billion in today's worth of freight annually. The impact of their contribution is still felt today, as the freight rail industry still transports nearly 40% of goods and products each year, supporting 1.5 million American jobs. Additionally, if you like wine, you may especially appreciate this data point. California is home to one of the most prolific and well-regarded wine industries in the world, producing 90% of all US wine today. In the late 19th century, Chinese immigrants helped to establish the foundation of the California wine industry in Napa and Sonoma by constructing roads, stone bridges, rock walls, wine cellars, and irrigation ditches. They also worked in vineyards in Southern California. Between 1856 and 1869, Chinese workers planted the majority of Sonoma County's 3.2 million grapevines. It's estimated that the entire wine industry in California would have been set back 30 to 50 years without the contribution of Chinese vineyard workers. Next slide, please. Chinese Americans have also been important drivers of US scientific advancement and innovation, creating jobs and capital market growth. We're well represented in STEM-related occupations across computer science, biotech, engineering, and other industries. From 1995 to 1998, 1 in 5 tech startups in Silicon Valley were run by Chinese immigrants. At the end of that 3-year period, these companies generated over $13.2 billion in sales and created up to 42,000 jobs. Fast forward to 2011 to 2020, we've now seen 9 Fortune 500 companies, creating a combined 332,000 jobs, and their market cap together amounting to $578 billion at their historical peak. And then on the right side, you'll see what's a hall of fame of sorts of Chinese American entrepreneurs in business and technology. The semiconductor industry in particular is one critically important area in which Chinese Americans time and again are still making major strides. In 1963, Chi-Tang Saw invented complementary metal oxide semiconductor used in nearly all modern semiconductor chips, laying the foundation for the following entrepreneurs and business leaders: Jensen Huang of NVIDIA, David K. Lam of Lam Research, and Lisa Su, who's president and CEO of Advanced Micro Devices, AMD. And then, additionally, we see other well-known household names like Zoom, founded by Eric S. Yuan, YouTube, co-founded by Stephen Chen, Yahoo, co-founded by Jerry Yang, and then Fortinet, founded by Ken Xie. Their success was also only made possible by by academic exchange between the US, China, and Taiwan, and an immigration policy that recognized the value of attracting the world's, oh,
Director of Public Relations roles.
there we go, sorry, um, of attracting the world's talented, ambitious minds and hearts. Many of the Chinese American entrepreneurs and business leaders came to the US to study and remained here, creating jobs and even more opportunities for others. Next slide, please. So Dean Miller mentioned one Supreme Court case, United States versus Wong Kim Ark. Wong Kim Ark was born in the US to Chinese immigrant parents who were Chinese citizens. Wong previously had visited China and returned to the US without any issues with re-entry. But in 1895, upon returning from another trip to China, he was detained at customs in SF for 5 months on steamships in the harbor. With legal help and support from the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, Wong challenged the decision, which ended up being heard by the US Supreme Court. In a 6-2 decision, the court definitively ruled that if a child is born in the US to Chinese citizens who are lawful permanent residents, that child is then a US citizen under the Citizenship Clause of the 14th Amendment. Wong's case confirmed birthright citizenship, a case that has had an immeasurable impact on America, contributing to the wealth and ethnic, racial, and linguistic diversity, just to mention some, in our country. I and my sister most likely would not be here today without this ruling, and so I'm very thankful. As my parents, were obviously, not U.S. citizens when they first arrived in this country. Next slide, please. Another moment in Chinese American history that is integral to the Chinese American narrative is the 1982 murder of Vincent Chin. Chin was a 27-year-old Chinese American from Michigan who was killed by 2 white auto workers angered by the loss of auto manufacturing jobs at the time to Japan. They brutally beat Chin with a baseball bat, but received a punishment of 0 jail time and only $3,000 in fines with 3 years probation. This tragedy triggered an outpouring of collective grief in not only the Chinese American community, but also the overall Asian American community. Chinese American youth, parents, and grandparents marched and protested around the country, demanding justice for Chin, his family, and Asian Americans everywhere. Kind of similar to some of the rallies and protests we've seen since the beginning of this year, focused on anti-Asian hate. At the same time, right, these protests also are strongly tied with the protests we saw last year, focused on Black Lives Matter. And so, I think it's important to emphasize that protests and, joining with other groups in our society, right, and raising our collective voice for justice have long been part of our DNA as Americans and as Chinese Americans. Next slide, please. Last but not at all least is the Chinese Americans who make enormous contributions in the arena of public health. Chinese Americans account for 7% of biological, medical, and other life scientists in the US, more than 5 times their share in the total US population. The 7% of all those scientists and doctors includes a substantial number of doctors on the front lines of the still ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, other doctors still seeing patients during this climate, and scientists and researchers focused on developing vaccines. The N95 mask also, the staples and doctors and nurses fight against COVID-19, was also invented by an American of Chinese heritage by the name of Peter Tsai. And then in the fight against the HIV/AIDS epidemic, several Chinese American researchers made remarkable contributions to containing the epidemic and safeguarding public health. In the mid-1990s, David Ho, a leading Chinese American physician, developed an HIV treatment known as combination antiretroviral therapy, which involves a combination of drugs that works together to help to treat HIV. This treatment proved to be a turning point in the epidemic. Dr. Ho's therapy transformed AIDS from a fatal disease into a treatable, non-life-threatening condition. Since its implementation in 1996, this therapy has helped to significantly reduce HIV/AIDS mortality in the US and beyond. So far, more than 25 million people worldwide have benefited from this treatment. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are some of the obstacles preventing further Chinese American contribution to the US? Some of the things that we covered in our presentation very quickly, right, include the limited English language abilities and lower education levels within our community, And then something we didn't get to cover, but really impacts, our ability to advocate for ourselves to policymakers, is lower voter turnout rates than the national level. Additionally, Chinese Americans, are still vastly underrepresented in leadership positions across industries, even in, the education sector, where, oftentimes in public imagination, right, Chinese Americans, may, play a larger role in people's minds. Chinese Americans still only account for less than 0.5% of all college presidents, despite having 2.2% of teaching and research occupations. And then finally, anti-Chinese sentiment continually, rears its head in our society due to not just the pandemic, but also an ingrained racism related to geopolitical tensions between the US and China, which continue to further these harmful narratives of Chinese Americans as perpetual foreigners. Next slide, please. Some other key takeaways include, that one, Chinese Americans have consistently contributed to the US across industry. And you'll see that when you dig further in our microsite and look at our reports, despite this history of discrimination. Second, Chinese Americans have contributed in different ways over time. And, we really see that Chinese Americans can contribute more and more so long as American society is welcoming to Chinese Americans and other immigrants. And thirdly, there is, enormous potential in our community to contribute despite this history of discrimination. And so the more, we shed these exclusionary attitudes and stereotypes about Chinese people and Chinese Americans, the more Chinese Americans will be able to confidently play, very productive roles in American society. Next slide, please. And so I won't go in depth here, just given our time, but these are some calls to action that C100 identifies and other AAPI groups have identified as well as areas of focus for our community. The first line being advocating for Asian American studies across, high school curricula or middle school curricula at the public school level, across the country. And I think there have been very positive efforts in Illinois where a bill is making a lot of progress. And so, definitely keep your radar on Asian American studies as something for our community to advocate for. Next slide, please. Again, the microsite that we developed with the Economist Intelligence Unit, definitely check it out. I'll put the link in the chat as we go on with the event. Next slide, please. And then Committee 100, definitely also, stay in touch with us if you're interested in learning more about us and these kinds of events. Definitely reach out at c100@committee100.org. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Lloyd. And now we'll have comments from Judy Wu and Jennifer Wong.
Thank you so much, Dean Miller, and thank you so much, Lloyd, for sharing this very thorough and thoughtful report. I really want to commend Committee 100 for what they are doing. This is the leadership within the Chinese American community and the fact that they are able to partner with mainstream institutions and mainstream publications to really foreground the history of Chinese Americans, I think is really remarkable. I think all of us have experienced during this past pandemic, which is both a public health pandemic, but also a racial pandemic, the hunger that people have for understanding why we have the society that we have today. And so I want to thank you for doing this very important work. I also want to highlight 3 aspects of the report that I find really interesting and necessary, but I'm also going to push the report a little bit further as well, and end with some reflections about a project that focuses on contributions and to also showcase a contemporary example of activism. So one thing I think is very important for the report to emphasize is the class diversity within our community. And this is very personal for me. My uncle just recently passed away, and we just had a celebration of life for him this last weekend. And I always thought of him as my uncle who was there for family get-togethers. And I knew he was very successful, but it was pretty remarkable to learn about his expansive influence in Silicon Valley. And so he's among those people who are making or have been making entrepreneurial contributions to American society. But I also think about my own family as well. My father passed away last year, and he was someone who experienced downward mobility when he came to the United States, which is also common among immigrants. And I grew up in a household where we all worked at a family restaurant, then at a family convenience store. And so you just see within my own family the class disparity among the Chinese Americans. And even though it was all hands on deck for our family, we were still relatively privileged compared to others. My parents were able to immigrate through my uncle's sponsorship. We were able to get a US citizenship, but there's also a significant portion of the Chinese American community who are undocumented and don't have access to the full promise of the United States. But I really want to commend the importance of highlighting that class diversity within your report. I also wanted to commend the report for highlighting women. So it wasn't just all sort of great Chinese American men, but there were also important women who were making contributions in the science field, in political activism. I'm just going to share with you somebody I've worked on. Her name is Margaret Chung. She was the first American-born Chinese woman doctor. And I found her interesting, not only in her professional life, but also in her personal life. She chose not to marry. She cross-dressed at some point in her life. And so she's a really interesting queer figure, which again gives us insights to the diversity within the Chinese American community. I also want to just foreground two other women. One is Eileen Berman, who's actually the sister of John Fu. And John Fu has highlighted the report as the first Chinese American general. But I know of his sister in two capacities. One is that she was part of Women's Strike for Peace, which is an organization by middle-class women who were concerned about nuclear proliferation, concerned about international conflict. And so Eileen Berman was very active in that organization, and in fact traveled to Southeast Asia just as the war in Vietnam, the US war in Vietnam began. And she was interested in trying to find ways to bring peace. Another person I wanted to highlight is Ying Lee Kelly. She was the first Asian American person to be elected to the Berkeley City Council. She was an anti-war candidate in the 1970s. She became involved with Black Lives Matter. She was a grandmother against war. So I find these women really interesting because they are in many ways engaging in the American project, the American political project, but they also have very critical views about some of the fundamental values that the United States represents, namely militarism and imperialism. And so I think it's really important to think not only about the gender diversity, but also think about the political diversity within our community. And the third aspect, which I'm leading to, is that I'm so appreciative of the report for highlighting politics and political advocacy. The report does an extensive critique of Chinese Americans and the perception of them as being perpetually foreign. But there's also evidence in the report to challenge the idea of the model minority, which suggests that Chinese Americans and Asian Americans are succeeding despite obstacles, that they work hard, they have strong families, that they're making educational and economic inroads. But I think foregrounding political advocacy is really challenging the idea that people are doing this quietly, that they're accepting what already exists instead of challenging and advocating for social justice. And here again, I want to push the report a little bit more. There's a rise of, I think, Chinese American activism more broadly, but on both, on all sides of the political spectrum, including very conservative forms of political activism. And so I think it's really important for people within our community to think about what is at stake, what are the values that we want to advocate, and that we may have very conflicting goals. Is it about protecting and advancing Chinese American access and rights? Is it about critiquing American racial inequality? And how do these two positions perhaps differ in one another? What are the ways in which we might build connections with African American community, with Latinx communities, with Indigenous communities, Pacific Islander communities, especially since Indigenous and Pacific Islander communities also have potentially a critique of the United States and its broader project as a settler colonial project. So I think these are really complicated questions, and I really appreciate the existence of the report for giving us a platform for having these conversations. But I just want to end with two things. One is to ask about what it means to focus on the contributions of Chinese Americans, or the contributions of a marginalized, racialized group. That in many ways we have to prove over and over again that we are worthy of being considered American. I recently watched the episode called The Good Americans. That's part of the Asian American series. It's a wonderful series if people have not had a chance to look at it. And this particular episode focused on the creation of the model minority representation in the midst of the emergence of the Cold War 1960s. And one of the really powerful scenes has to do with a Chinese family that the father had to burn his letters, his poetry, because he thought that they might connect him with the suspicion of being a communist. And I think about not just the contributions of Chinese Americans, but what are the costs of those contributions, of having to prove that one is a good American. So I wanted to just end, I wanted to share a little bit from Michael Lowe's New York Times letter, but I want to give some time for my colleague Jennifer Wang to speak. So instead, I'm going to share a video that was recently sent to me. These are elderly women in San Francisco Chinatown taking a stance on anti-war, anti-racism, and I hope you'll enjoy the video.
Group in California about becoming victims of violence.
That's according to a new statewide poll that found 73% of Asian Americans are afraid of becoming victims of violence, and 68% worried about being bullied, mocked, or harassed in public. Now, a group of Bay Area grandmothers are making their own moves against the spike in anti-Asian attacks.
Only on 5, Sharon Chin has a preview of the rap they're planning to record.
These senior citizens are making their own moves against Asian hate crimes with a new rap in Cantonese. In English, that's beware of the chicken feather duster.
Using the gai mo so, it's this chicken feather duster, it had a hard base, and so when you were naughty and getting out of line, then the parents would go after you with that.
Okay. The rap, written by Clara Sue, director of the Clarion Performing Arts Center, where the ladies practice in the heart of San Francisco Chinatown. The message is direct.
We are the authority. Don't mess with us.
Okay. Clara is rehearsing with members of the Grant Avenue Follies, an 18-year senior citizen group that recalls the city's golden nightclub era. The dancers have toured in Las Vegas, China, and Cuba, but mostly the Follies perform locally for the elderly and fundraising galas, raising millions of dollars for senior citizens groups.
It really affects me.
But this time, Pat Nishimoto says, they're raising awareness about the crimes that spark fear.
With all these violent attacks, I'm just really careful. I don't think I'll be going to Stowe Lake by myself now.
Seniors are not just, old people walking on the street. We are powerful, and we want to show that, and to show it in an entertaining way.
Respect the seniors, respect the grandmas.
Follies co-founder Cynthia Yee says they feel empowered to act.
With this rap, I want to show the people, don't be mean to grandma. If it wasn't for grandma, you wouldn't be here.
The dozen members of the Follies are enlisting a choreographer to develop a routine and post online. They hope to perform it at rallies to stop Asian hate. These grandmothers say their weapon is their voices, heard loud, clear, and united.
Ready, go. Beware, beware of the perfect.
In San Francisco, Sharon Chin, KPIX 5.
And the group is now looking.
I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Miss Jennifer Wang, and I hope you'll remember our voice is our power. Jennifer, I think you're muted.
Thank you, Judy. I appreciate your voice, and I appreciate everybody within this space, actually, for allowing us to really amplify our voice. My name is Jennifer. I'm actually the Chief Operating Officer of the Asian American Senior Citizen Service Center. We're based in Santa Ana, California. We're a 501c nonprofit organization, and we were founded more than 30 years ago, 1989, with the Chinese philosophy, caring for elders as if they were our own. And in Chinese, it's 老老已经人之老. And our principal mission actually is dedicated to increasing the awareness and needs of our Asian American elders and assisting their access to essential healthcare and social services and promoting a dignified life of living in the community. And we've basically been entrusted to serve, protect, and celebrate our elders, our youth, and families as they progress through different stages of life. We believe in the intergenerational approach to building a stronger and healthier community through direct services, advocacy, and capacity building. And given our history and community support, actually, we were started because of a wave, an immigration wave in Orange County, in which we had lots of students from Taiwan, Hong Kong, just all over Asia actually coming here. And they decided to stay here to raise their kids. And they also brought over their parents. And as their parents aged, they realized they didn't really have a space for them to meet others, to really keep them stimulated, you know, keep their livelihood. Even though their kids were growing up, they still had a second chapter, a third chapter in their life to live. And so we had the Chinese American Lions Club, we had the Chinese Chamber of Commerce, and then Orange County Chinese Cultural Club come together to fundraise. And the way they fundraised, actually, they hosted the very first Chinese American debutante ball. And to tell you the truth, as a kid, I remember seeing that on TV somewhere. One of the news channels covered it. And they raised enough money to just kickstart this center. And the center actually means a lot to us because our approach in the beginning particularly, it was just to serve the Chinese diaspora of immigrants and refugees. And that included, of course, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and then eventually, you know, China, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, Philippines, like all these countries that just our Chinese diaspora are just part of. And with that being said, our center, we're equipped with multilingual, very diverse group of staff and volunteers in which we have to be able to serve in Mandarin, Cantonese, Taiwanese, Chuchao, Hakka, Shanghainese, I mean, all these different dialects. We also work in solidarity with the rest of our API community. So we also have in-house our Vietnamese and our Korean, particularly in Orange County, the largest population of API is our Vietnamese community. And what we do is we really are emphasizing effective, equitable, and compassionate care so that we can empower our most vulnerable, because for them, we can't be with them 24/7. And last year was an example of just the investment that we have really provided their community, and we can see that it worked because, at least for me, like I'm motivated by the vision and the culture that we have to build collaboratives, because we not only have to move minds, we have to move hearts. We have to humanize our Chinese American community. We have to humanize our API community. We have to humanize our BIPOC community. You know, during the pandemic, we really had to dig deep and intentionally work in faith because it was sort of unpredictable. Because of our connection with Asia, for example,
Jennifer?
It seems like she might have frozen.
Oh no, okay.
Should we maybe take some questions while
Yeah,
we're waiting for Jennifer?
I was trying to figure out if Jennifer was frozen or if I was frozen, but we'll wait for her to, I think she'll probably have to drop out and come back on. So I will pose a couple of questions that have come in, and I'll just remind people to use the question and answer function to pose questions. And I'm going to start with a question that actually is kind of posed by two people on the chat and the Q&A. they're related elements. So let me pose this to the two of you and Jennifer when she comes back on. So Lloyd, in your talk, you mentioned that the oppression of Chinese Americans often intersects with oppression on other minorities. And could you say more about this in relation to potential coalition building among communities of color? And this was posed by another question about how is C100 building cross-ethnic and cross-racial solidarity?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. So, this kind of racism against Chinese Americans obviously didn't happen in a vacuum. Japanese Americans were, of course, sent to internment camps during World War II. We saw with the post 9/11 sort of hysteria over, brown Americans with ties to South Asia, right? Another issue there. So this theme of, Asians, and then not even just Asians, but people who just aren't white as something dangerous or suspect continually crops up. And so in 2020, right, amidst a lot of the tragedies involving George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, all this consistent stream of news and injustice, C100 really, I think, did a lot of reflection and like took a look at the last 30 years and saw that there was a different path we could take, and we needed to invest in our community because our community was hurting, based off of injustices related to COVID racism, but also seeing the pain of other communities. We started to build bonds with our community through talks like these in the Chinese American community with other Asian American groups. And then at the same time, also doing a PPE drive in which we raised millions of dollars, then donated these supplies to Black and Latino communities that often weren't getting the resources that they really needed. And so we were able to donate a lot of PPE to different hotspots around the country, working with different congressional offices, working with groups like the NAACP, the National Urban League, as well as other groups. We've also been building a lot of ties with Jewish groups like the Anti-Defamation League and the American Jewish Committee. And so, these kinds of partnerships are just a beginning. And, it's really important for us to be able to hold events in which our communities can cross-learn from one another. But of course, this is just the beginning. And so I think that's just a very short bit to what we have done so far.
Thank you. Judy and Jennifer, I don't know if you want to comment, and Jennifer, you were, I think, off when we posed this question, but it was a question really about the intersection of the oppression of Chinese Americans with oppression of other minorities, and the questions that raises for the possibilities for cross-ethnic and cross-racial coalition building and solidarity.
I mean, we're at a pivotal point, I think, in our legacy building and fostering these meaningful relationships. Because, for example, a couple of weeks ago in Orange County, we had the resolutions from the supervisors that were written in solidarity against the hate. And that was actually written by Chinese American women. And when the supervisor actually decided whether to pass it, a bunch of Asian American women actually went and spoke on behalf of the resolutions. And since then, because I also serve on the Human Relations Commission in Orange County, I'm on the ad hoc committee, and we are most definitely thinking about the cross sections between the BIPOC, because it's not limited to us. We just have the spotlight on us right now. The increase of the hate and the violence against us is definitely real. And we definitely talk about, like we are being intentionally hunted down in many spaces, but it's across the board. And within Orange County, at least, this is a very brown and yellow county, and we have to approach it as such.
My kids are printing something in the printer, and it's in my room, so I apologize. I agree with what is being proposed by Jennifer and Lloyd. I think it's so essential. I don't think we can understand this country without understanding Native American removal, enslavement, the ways in which certain immigrant communities, racialized communities are brought in because their labor is needed, but that their full personhood is denied. So I think these are really important issues that need to be understood in relation to each other, and that there are deep divides between these various communities as well. And so we really need to work on kind of self-education to think about spaces where we can come together and build bridges. I think this is really at the heart of what needs to be done.
I think we have time for one more question, and I want to thank again Doug Haynes. I know that the Chancellor is having a town hall at 1 o'clock, so a lot of people from UCI will be jumping off for that. But thank you again, Doug. And I just wanted to quickly pose this other question. How is the recent wave of migrants from mainland China affecting the political outlook and involvement of Chinese Americans in US politics?
I'll go first. So at least for us in Orange County, what I've been seeing is that it's definitely increased the diversity and the different voices at the table, if we're at the table at least. And for our part, because of this wave, I have to be very proactive with different agencies, including the healthcare agency, for example. They're a really great partner of ours because they started listening. And when we said, hey, we need these materials to be translated to Chinese, we actually had to explain to them what that meant in terms of there's the dialects, but there's also written. So there's a lot of education that we have to make. We have to be proactive, ensuring that things are translated in culturally appropriate, but also the fact that it's actually translated. Lots of education regarding, the difference between simplified and traditional. And for us, we've made a difference. A lot of the materials in Orange County have been, and they continue to be, but there's definitely room.
Yeah, I just want to keep my answer pretty short here, but we are seeing, as Judy mentioned in her remarks, this real diversity in advocacy, right? And some very fervent advocacy amongst different age groups, but also different waves and immigrants from China. I think Kaiser Kuo and I forget the director's name, they put out this documentary called First Vote, which covers this trend of very strong conservative advocacy amongst recent Chinese Americans, right? Recent mainlanders. And when we were doing our outreach to different professors at different universities and other groups across the country, we had, we actually experienced a lot of this diversity in ways that were not very favorable to us, or very, we've done, I think, over 24, if not more, of these kinds of virtual events. And some contacts we developed did not want to do this event for reasons that were very much tied up with their political beliefs and or perceived political sensitivities, and this kind of politics that is incredibly emotional on within our community is really rearing its head and becoming an obstacle, even just to basic level engagement or educational understanding, right? I think it's hard for us to be able to learn about their experiences and to even get to the point of validating them if they're, if a lot of groups aren't willing to come to the table and just find some common ground. And so there's a lot of work within our community that C100, I think, sees a lot of necessary work in doing. And so, that answer, just speaks to part of the issue for us, at least.
I feel a little bit like I'm on the on TV or the radio, because I need to ask you something that it will be about a 30-second, to answer, and it's a much bigger question. But I did want to register this. The points that you raised about underrepresentation in leadership, and this is true in academia as well. I wonder if you could, if briefly, if you have thoughts about ways that could be addressed to, to help promote more Asian American leaders and to encourage Asian Americans to be taking up leadership positions.
I think that institutions really have to be very mindful and intentional in promoting them, because I have, lots of people that I know within these amazing institutions, and they've done their dues, and they are always overlooked. And I always ask them, why do you think you were overlooked? And for them, their gut feeling tells them it's because of what they look like. They don't perceive them as strong leaders. They don't perceive them as being valued there. And that is just the reality of it. If you really compare their resume, the work that they've gone above and beyond. And oftentimes the people that are being hired, they really are not as qualified.
Yeah, and then very quickly, right? I think part of the issue lies, within the Chinese American or Asian American community. Like, we have to advocate that very strongly and collectively that Asian Americans are included in those new DEI initiatives that companies and different institutions are investing in, right? I think it's important that we are part of that multiracial coalition, that people see us being unrepresented, or that Asian Americans are struggling, right? And so we have to work in our community, but also with Black Americans, Latino Americans, Native Americans, so that we are all represented in these positions, and that it's not just white Americans get priority on the slice of the pie, and then the rest we have to divvy up amongst ourselves. That makes zero sense.
And oftentimes, we have to create our own pies. Lots of the CEOs, these companies within Orange County, for example, they are Chinese Americans. And I'll tell you a really quick story. 10 years ago, when I was representing the census, I was actually responsible for the Chinese American outreach. But because of our Chinese sort of diaspora, and seriously, this quiet power, as you can say, or perhaps this invisible power, I would get phone calls after phone calls saying, like, hey, I can get you into this president's office, I can get you that president's office. And it was all because of the Chinese connections. We're very relational. And once they saw me as somebody that was safe and that somebody they can take into that room, I was taken everywhere in Orange County. And one day I got called, hey, what are you doing in Little Saigon? And I said, well, this is a Vietnamese area. I can't touch that. I'm doing the Chinese part. They're like, well, the Chinese power, the power in Vietnam, in the Little Saigon, the godfather of Saigon is Chinese. You have to go to his office. And I was taken by a Lions Club member, a Chinese Lions Club member, past the secretary, past all the offices, into the CEO's office. And he signed the contract with me like within 2 minutes, because the Lions Club member, his friend, said so. And so that's why, like, at that time, I just saw like these sort of community power at hand. And, even right now with what we're doing, the solidarity work, if you really look at those who are actually doing the work, like the hard work, it's our Chinese Americans. It really, really is. They're the ones that are putting up the money, and like they're putting up the time, they're putting up the resources. And not only that, the ones that are struggling, because like for us, like I said, we're in Santa Ana. A lot of people ask me, why aren't you in Irvine? Everybody knows about Irvine, why aren't you in Irvine? We made that decision because actually within our Chinese American community, we have the very wealthy, and then we also have the very poor. And within this space here, I actually really want to emphasize that I hope that our community will invest in both spectrums. Invest in, yes, I understand our need to be in mainstream, tables, but don't forget about Chinese Americans or Chinese immigrants, the ones that I just said, like who are coming from China. There's like super wealthy, but there's also the super not. And they are struggling. It's a real struggle. They don't have the resource. They don't know how to make the connections. And that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. And we are at the end of our time. So I want to, first of all, thank our presenters, Lloyd and Judy and Jennifer, all of our attendees. And I encourage you to look at the Committee of 100's website for the report and the other materials, because it's a very rich set of things, and it's definitely worth taking some time to read through. So thank you again for all of you in taking part in this event.
Thank you so much to the Committee for 100, and also to Professor Yang Chang for doing a lot of the organizing work for this session.
Thank you all so much.